Can you hear me?
Yes, you are. Okay.
Okay, excellent, great. I'll take a POI in the chat around 5 minutes. Okay. Okay, starting in 3, 2, 1, go. The crux of our case is very simple, right? Firstly, we're going to explain why AI development is going to be more incentivized on our side and why it's actually a precondition to develop AI for companies and give them incentives to develop AI in the first place by allowing AI to be closed source. And secondly, I'm going to explain why the AI just is much easier to regulate and just is much more likely to give safer outputs and how we prevent this from falling into the hands of bad actors. Okay, so firstly, why AI development is disincentivized by making it open source. Because the reason by making it closed source means that people are unable to see that the code that was used to train the AI and what the AI looks like. This means that you have a lot of protection from unauthorized copying, from unauthorized modification or distribution of what you've produced. That's the definition of what it means to be closed source. So what is AI, right? AI is just a bunch of code that is able to take in some data and give an output, right? And this requires a huge amount of effort to develop in the first place. Why? Firstly, because you require a huge amount of expertise to develop this. You need a small group of AI experts to do this. Notice that this is a relatively nascent field that's only been around for the last 10 years, 10, 20 years. And so the sort of experts that exist and have the relevant academic credentials to do this are very sparse. Notice that, for example, the main brain behind OpenAI is like 3 academics who are literally publishing things in their field, right? These are the sort of people that you require. You require huge amounts of incentives to attract them, and there's huge number of AI startups that want to attract them. So it's a huge startup cost as like an investor to try and get these people to work for you. But secondly, why is it really important? It's because it's really hard to train up this AI before you start selling it, right? Notice that for something like ChatGPT needs to have huge amounts of manual training to do so. That is, you literally have a human being sit down and input some like prompts into that AI, and then when it gives out some options, it gives out like three different outputs. You select the best output from that. That's a hugely manual process when you have to scale that to millions and millions of prompts to begin to train that AI. The same thing goes to like pictures, where you have to like mark the AI to make sure it's red. There's huge amounts of startup costs to this. And so by making it closed source, we actually create commercialization incentives to actually give these investors a reason to put money into all these startup costs. Because notice, you can't make any money until you develop that product. And so we want to create these avenues to monetize this properly. So yes, smaller businesses might be more delayed, but we believe that the market over time will be incentivized through competition between different companies giving different products, that the price of the AI would go down eventually. But it's the initial hurdle of getting that investment that's really important to get the development occurring in the first place. So what happens, right? Fewer businessmen and fewer investors are willing to engage their money into AI because it's such a risky venture. So thousands of AI companies fail every year, and it requires such high startup costs. It's very risky for these investors to give money considering that they want to make a profit from this. So they need to be incentivized by a much higher profit than you would expect from an investor in, for example, securities or something else. So what this means, right, is and also there's a huge risk of like losses, because if you have no product, you can't recuperate any costs, right? You can't like sell the AI expert that you hired if they've not produced anything. So what this means, right, is by having complete control of the AI, you're going to be able to monetize this much more, because A, you're able to set your price to a higher standard, which means that you're able to charge people to use your product in the first place. Whereas on their side, large companies can just use open source and use their own in-house software engineers to try and like take that open source from GitHub and just like copy and paste it over and try and implement it into their workflows. So you're able to make so much more money from this by simply selling this, right? And secondly, the competition is less, so you're able to make some of those profits in the short term. So yes, in the long term, loads of AI companies will come, but at the beginning, you have the only product. So this is something you can charge more money for, which means that you're able to get more money recuperated for this, therefore incentivizing investors to come in the first place because they see it's so profitable, right? This is extremely important, right, as well. Thirdly, though, is that this company now has additional money from this licensing money that they can sell to large corporations, which are able to foot the bill for these AI products and want to foot the bill for these AI products because these products can give new innovations and can cut their costs. But this is really important, right? Because you're able to grow this company. Notice that very few AI companies are able to create a product that is sellable. A moment a company is able to do this, you want this company to have more money and more capital and be more profitable so that it can reinvest that money back into its systems to improve those systems, to regulate those systems better, to give systems that are more adaptable and give better outputs. All of this is a precondition to developing AI in the first place and getting all the benefits in AI in health, to save literal lives, to design drugs, to design airplanes, to save and cut costs in businesses and make it so it's cheaper for consumers to earn these things. We get all of those impacts faster, but we explain how it's a precondition to unlock all those impacts. But secondly, and even more importantly, is AI can lead to bad outputs. The bad outputs are not from the code, it's from the data that you use. Transparency in this debate is extremely marginal because how does an LLM work, right? It's just a matrix of numbers and weights that take in different bits of data and say, this is a correlation with this output, this is a correlation with a good thing and a bad thing, right? Notice that if you see it printed out, it's just millions and millions of rows of numbers. Nobody can read it. OG admits it's a black box, but they wrongly assume that companies know what this black box is saying. The reason it's a black box is even the experts who design these AIs don't know what these AIs do in the first place. So just because it's open source doesn't mean you know what it does and know you can interpret it. If the best AI experts can't do it, the best companies can't interpret it, then it's unlikely that your average consumer can interpret it or your average government can interpret it. So I don't see why this has changed. What does change is the training data, because the moment it's closed source, the only person that can train the AI is us. Before I continue, I'll take the POI from closing.
Yeah, so presumably like the GPT data set is not proprietary, it's public open source information. Presumably part of the open source part is that we will give the data set that we use to train the data.
And the moment it's open source, you know that this is the only data that has been used to train the model. So you can validate the open source data that's been used to train the code, right? But notice that on your side, when it's open source, like the code is open source, anyone can train their own AI using their own data sets. And that's where the real danger is, because companies have huge incentives to do this well with their training data. First, for the very reason you say that they give it publicly, but secondly, because it's a product with their name attached to it, and they want to, and thirdly, they're much easier to regulate because they're company registered, so the government can look at them. What happens on your side is when it's open source, the general public or companies or anyone without AI expertise can take this and train their own things without properly cleaning their data or adhering to government regulations on this data of what this data does. This is even worse when malicious actors like China can access your code and now start using their own training data sets to use it. This is how they develop things like facial recognition AI that's used in Xi'an. That you get lots of abuses from this, but you also open up risks from North Korea and all these different people, different malicious actors who use this for malicious reasons. This is terrible. Even if the risk is small, the outcome of this can be so terrible. We want to prevent this in the long term. For all these reasons, extremely proud to oppose.
We would like to thank the leader of opposition for this speech. Let's now call on the
All right, I'll get started with the extension in a couple of seconds. What we're going to do on Closing Gov is provide two things. Firstly, that I think you get dramatically more industry-wide innovation, both in the development of AI, but also the cross-development of proprietary AI software, as well as the application of AI to key industries, which are you're never going to get in opposition's world without it being open source. And secondly, why I think under status quo, as well as without this, you see the massive overreach of the patenting of novel AI software and code, which is incredibly bad for society. We're going to explain why, but first let's take opening opposition out of the round. I think the issue with their case is they seem to think that running an artificial intelligence software is like a drawing or something, where if you have a picture of the drawing, then you can just have an identical picture of a drawing and show that. The problem is that to run an artificial intelligence, the kind that OpenAI use, you have enormous computing and server costs. That's why when you go to use ChatGPT, they limit the amount of sort of queries you're allowed to make in a day, because if you didn't, or you can pay them money for their server costs in order to use it more. If they didn't do that, then they wouldn't be able to pay the server costs. So I don't think this means that if I put up the upfront capital and develop a server, and I'm running AI through it, that any company in the world can just come in and completely outcompete me. But secondly, I also think there's a first to market advantage. People know what ChatGPT is already. So if another person just copies it and runs the same software, why would I go to them over the person I'm already familiar with, the brand that's already established? As well, in status quo, there's so much consolidation within key industries that I don't think there's going to be the massive removal of competition that they're describing. Now that OO is dealt with, let's get into substantially more industry innovation. So there's 3 dimensions to this extension. The first is the broad scale, more development of like efficiencies in AI overall. So when code is online, freely available for everyone to see, experts can go in, notice small inefficiencies in how the code operates, fix those efficiencies, improve its productivity, right? Instead of using a really complicated way to solve a problem that uses lots of battery power and lots of computing, you solve it more effectively. This is a big thing that differentiates a good coder from a bad coder, right? Well, when you're on open software, you have all the good coders all working together to make really important AI software on which huge industries are going to be depending on, like the very rock at the bottom of a tower holding it up, that make those softwares as efficient as possible. At scale, I think this is a substantial improvement to the productivity of economies overall, especially considering how much economies are likely to grow as a result of artificial intelligence. But secondly, I think you can also offer important data sets you're unlikely to get in other ways, right? So languages, which are unlikely researchers might not know about or might not have language from, can be volunteered by people. Faces of racial minorities that artificial intelligences often struggle with, voices of people from other parts of the world can be brought into the fold and can ensure that the AI is effective at meeting their needs and doesn't cut them out when the artificial intelligence does things. In places like healthcare, it's really, really important for artificial intelligences to be as good as scanning people for something like sickle cell, which only affects African Americans, as it does for other types of cancers, which affect everybody. Second of all, I think you get dramatically more proprietaries on our side of the house. What does this mean? It means that if you're a company who sees a gap in the market, you don't have to reinvent the wheel. You don't have to invent an artificial intelligence from the ground up. You can leapfrog off of existing tech to have your novel, interesting idea and apply it in a niche way that might be really, really useful. Note that large companies can't just access every single niche application. They just don't have that capacity. Amazon, can't do anything, can't do everything, unfortunately for Jeff Bezos. But for a lot of people, there might be a unique application to that code when it's open, they can grab and apply to that niche area. This is happening already with lots of websites finding applications for ChatGPT in novel contexts. Imagine if this was free whole scale, how many places in different areas this would be good. Another example could be AlphaFold's code for protein folding could be really, really useful in niche pharmaceutical applications to find superior vaccines or get new vaccines for research into other forms of healthcare. But you can't do this without it being open source. Thirdly, there are a lot of specific industries, particularly useful for slow-moving industries. So think about like legacy companies that are full of really old people, don't have significant computing departments, government services, which can never compete on wages with private capital, that just aren't likely to realize the full potential of their economic productivity because they don't have access to coders. They can bring in and use the AI softwares which already exist that help their efficiency. Before I impact this out, opening.
You make major AI projects that are already quite successful a tiny bit more efficient. We ensure the pace of AI development is measured and we get sufficient level of new technologies to make the AI revolution happen.
I don't think anything like, first of all, it's pretty dismissive to say that more efficient AI research is not at scale really important, but I already explained through proprietary and specific industry application how we get substantially more applications of the AI we already have. I don't care if there's a new type of ChatGPT because we already have it. Why wouldn't we just apply and make the version of ChatGPT that already exists and the company that's already perfecting it more efficient at doing that? Why the fuck would you need 2 burgers? Just have one better burger, right? Impact this out. we get really, really unique, new, valuable applications of AI the market otherwise never gets. This means more efficient products and services. This means more productivity, which means less hungry people starving to death. This is obviously the most important impact in the debate. I don't care about the speculation from opening government in terms of like, what if, maybe AI has some like weird niche thing. We just get more productive economies, which means people are safer, they have more money, which is really important given the costs facing the world of a green transition, economic recovery, aging populations, and an increase in defense spending. Just note that I think this is the most obvious thing for you to vote on because it's very, very simple. Economic productivity is obviously something that the average person cares a lot about. Most things in this round are speculative, but stronger economic development and productivity is not at all. Very proud to propose.
We'd like to thank the member of comment for this speech. Let's now call a member of opposition.
So now just keep the recording rolling. I'm like happy to speak. I'm assuming I'm audible.
Yes, you are.
Okay. My time starts 3, 2, 1. Now. The comparative is not that you get 2 burgers or 1 burger, it's that at the point in which you open the recipe to making this burger to everyone else in the world, that is the point in which there are lots of competitive incentives to fuck your company over. There's 3 points of framing, and then there's 2 extensions. Firstly, on the principle of intellectual property. Second, on how misuse of tech becomes significantly easier on their side of the house. Firstly, I just think it's hard to use AI in its worst cases in the first place, in the point in which accountability exists on either side of the house from the companies themselves, at the point in which they can we're still happy to support regulations for specific companies themselves. But second, also the type of AI research are just incredibly unlikely to be really shady and harmful in the first place. At the point in which this is a wider market and therefore AI is very underdeveloped, and it is empirically true that the ways in which AI is used within the status quo look like things like ChatGPT. I don't think this is widely contested. But second, on the ease of access and development, because look, I think academic methods of developing learning models already exist and are publicized as they created. What does this mean? This means that the barrier to entry for formulating these programs or projects is actually quite low for 2 reasons. Because first, how do experts literally learn to code in the first place? And these are also the same experts that are then employed to these companies after they go to university and after they learn from whatever like comp sci master's program they do in top universities. It is in these particular institutions that they say have experts and professors that impart the knowledge of these projects to happen in the first place. But second, I think academic spaces have the incentive to share this anyways at the point in which they operate on different codes and models from these corporate places when they believe in democratization of information and allowing people to gain access to those skills in the first place. So I don't know why there's a massive trade-off in what the public knows and what the public can access if they had the incentive to be able to do so and go seek out that information versus what company heads are already gatekeeping. But third, I just don't think that companies will use this as opportunities to work together at the point in which there are large competitive incentives to gatekeep this. And I think this responds to both teams on GovBench. Because look, even if companies are the most benevolent, they are more proximal to individual workers who you rip off when you allow other people to also make money off your own projects. This beats CG when they say that collaborations happen, but also that somehow you cannot co-opt these things, because at the point in which there are competitive incentives not to co-opt, or if CG also says operates on the AI capacity level, I don't know why there's an incentive to break out of the prisoner's dilemma, which is the mechanism that both govs need to prove before they can access collaboration in the first place. So CG's maybe a little derivative there, or at least reliant on the OG mechanism. But second, the response we get then to what Matt tells you in the POI is like, the prisoner's dilemmas exist, and therefore this is not necessarily comparative. The problem is, what is our comparative now? The comparative is, if OO is right, nobody literally invests in AI research at all. If the comparative is that they can take their tech and it is significantly easier and more convenient to do things like save research costs or do things like invest in other places, so this just creates an even worse dilemma at the point in which there's a race to the bottom to not invest or to not engage with AI at all. Before I move on, OG. All right, I'll take it later then. The first extension on what this looks like for the principal. Because look, research that is publicly funded is already going to be in the public domain. As such, information is already somewhat accessible. So what realistically changes in the round? What Gov realistically changes is that making the actual discoveries and inventions of private firms and research group public, which constitutes a huge principal violation because one, there's a reason why we literally have patent and IP laws, right? People have a right to their creations and discoveries, and the government has an obligation to protect these rights. The reason for this is because this violates the agency privacy of the individual. Because if I told somebody a really big secret and told them not to spread it, then spreading it or forcing them to spill the secret to lots of people around the world, even though I only consented into showing this to my close confidant, will be a violation of my express preference and agency. I think this is true at the point in which, one, if companies had an incentive to share, they will otherwise share the source code themselves. Second, this is important in protecting particular workers. I'll take the point.
Property rights are prima facie, not absolute. So in as much as you have competing obligations, in as much as we make AI safer, which helps everyone in the world, clearly that is a stronger obligation than our obligation to a relatively small number of individuals and their property rights.
Yeah, I'll respond to this later, I promise. I'll flag it too. Second, this is especially important for companies and workers because, look, these are the fruits of your independent labor and investment. At the point in which you invest lots of time and lots of human capital into doing things that literally give you a good livelihood, I don't think the government has the jurisdiction to take this away from individuals who rely on these things on their livelihood, who rely on these things to be able to fulfill their own subjective preferences. Why does the principle stand independently from the prag? Because, look, this is an action you ought not do, i.e., even if there are pragmatic advantages to doing things like having mass surveillance because everybody is safer, at the point to which it deprives people of the right to own property, at the point to which it deprives people of fulfilling their own individual preferences, this probably isn't a good thing. The gov response, as you get from that POI, is, aha, maybe this is a greater principle violation for small companies, but this is uncomparative for a couple of reasons. Look, and we're happy to take a higher burden from OO because this engages more directly with what the OG comparative actually looks like. One, I think there's still likely to be a few actors at the top and still likely to be dominated in those particular spaces because, one, a first mover advantage exists in gathering resources and sending patents over and doing things like developing the source code in the first place, which will probably still get gatekept by the Facebooks of the world on both sides of the house. But second, there's lots of manpower that's involved in doing things like developing AI source code because I don't think most innovations are the social network where Mark Zuckerberg makes Facebook in their basement, right? At the point in which these individuals have the most expertise, the most education, and there's also a few companies who have the capacity to pay these workers more to be able to actually get those particular goods. But I don't know why it is the case that they're more likely to equalize the playing field on their side of the house. The second extension here, and I want to be very clear with this, is that the misuse of tech is significantly easier on their side of the comparative. Because look, there are asymmetrical incentives on the extent to which you want to protect and treat the source code well. Because look, on our side of the comparative, or on both sides, companies have at least some incentive to not take egregiously bad actions with AI. Because first, they probably care about public opinion or the extent to which shareholders are going to ditch them if they do really bad things. But second, it is significantly easier or regulate to hold accountable as a result of the collective action problem. Because when one company breaks conduct and takes bad action, a race to the bottom for other companies to also do this is likely to matriculate on their side of the house. Asymmetrically, therefore, I think individuals clearly have none of this restriction at the point in which the same checking mechanisms do not necessarily exist for these particular individuals. At the point in which it is not their livelihood that is being held in jeopardy, but just whether or not they're able to make a quick profit off of ripping off whatever these companies do or applying it to particularly more shady places in the internet where they're able to exploit these particular types of codes. The reason why this is important leads to two implications. Because first, I think there's general high-strength AI models that could easily be misused to do things like crack passwords, like hack sites, like impersonate people, or do things like create deepfake videos. The incentive for this is that people are generally dicks and like have malicious incentives, right? So at the point at which things like deepfake already exist, these are alternative ways for people to weaponize AI in order to make money and implicate particular public figures within the commercial sphere. This escapes the framing of there being a few people who know AI because oftentimes you don't need all of ChatGPT to misuse or weaponize it. It is understanding a few bits and pieces in the source code that you believe could be exploited by things like malware, and that is where the worst type of harms actually occur. For these reasons, very proud to oppose.
Thank you, Member Pop. Let's now call on government.
A response to CO, a response to OO, a clarification of our case, and then weighing against OG. Hopefully we can ride on a gov bench in this debate. Okay, first in response to CO. First on their principle. I think A, you're not going to make it through on a principle just in and of itself, right? I think in a lot of cases, we're happy to violate IP for public good. That is why lots of countries don't enforce IP on really important pharmaceutical drugs because they weigh the saving of lives as being more important than IP law. So in terms of weighing in this debate, it's unclear what we ought value it greater than other potential goods. I think we're happy to stand for limitations to IP when it's something is very, very necessary for public good. Two, I think also a lot of companies in status quo abuse patent law. That is, when we look at what companies presently use like code, I think a lot of the code that companies push forward or patent status quo is heavily reliant on public research, right? So a lot of things like Google's PageRank algorithm, which is patented and is what they use for their efficacy of their search algorithm when you look on like Google search, right? This algorithm is patented by Google, not allowed to be used by other users, but is reliant on decades of public open source research. So in terms of standing for the IP law, given companies have a lot of structural incentives to violate patent law and status quo, I think we're violating the IP of the people who originally created that when we allow companies to co-opt public research, make slight modifications for proprietary usage, and then have a principle there. So I think A, we just fully outweigh the principle, but B, we also completely flip it given the uses of patent and why open source, based on how tech world works, is also prima facie good on our side. 2, misuse of tech is easier. I think A, like the regulation argument, I think completely outweighs this, but 2, I think also the scale of use is limited. Like the use of an individual abusing tech is less important than a large company abusing tech. But thirdly, like ChatGPT already exists. People use it to make spam. There are examples of deep fake porn. People are already doing that in status quo. Like all of the things they talk about potential abuses are things which presently exist in status quo. And so if they want to completely remake this argument in the CO, I guess they can do that, but CO whip. But I think in terms of what they said, the uses of this tech is already present. It's unclear why having access to the code base is the tipping point of people abusing existing technologies, which they have in status quo, to do bad in this debate. CO out of this debate. 2, OO. OO's entire argument is about investment and innovation into tech. I think A, we completely mitigate all of their analysis, and 2, I think Diggory's analysis actually flips this material. So let's dive right into this. So first, they say companies actually don't want to do this because now you get less of a return in investment from your tech, which means you're less likely to invest and we get less tech. A couple of problems with this. 1, companies actually do get lots of advantages with open sourcing. This is why lots of companies like Facebook have massive open source projects like the React JavaScript framework, which Facebook invests hundreds of millions of dollars into investing and developing, and then provides publicly anyway. Why do they do this? 1, you get first mover advantage from being the person who releases it. It takes a lot to create a product with an existing technology and deploying that. So the point to which you invent it yourself, you get to be the first person to release this technology, apply it to specific use cases. You have a couple months of use of exclusive access to this market, which means you obviously want to still be the person who develops it first. 2, often the market for tech requires that you provide a lot of other services, right? A lot of GPT's tech, like model, you can actually access and deploy yourself. The reason people use ChatGPT is because it requires a lot of servers and has a sleek interface, all of these things, which means, yes, maybe the technology can be open source, but the usage of the technology to make it applicable to a specific company or use as a usable product is not, right? So this is where the companies actually generate the revenue, not the specific technology in and of itself. So you want to actually provide better products and you still get the advantage there, right? So the argument insofar as you don't reap any of the benefits is just objectively untrue. So much of the current tech world is open source, and companies generate revenue from these, like from the usage and the like actual product that they sell to consumers or they sell to companies. That's where the money is to be made, right? Facebook's money isn't in their search algorithm. It's in Facebook, the website, and Facebook, the interface. That's where they actually reap their revenue. Thirdly, often development is case specific, right? So often you can get a ton of benefit from having other people contribute to your code in and of itself. Diggory tells you about this, right? The React JavaScript framework, which is open source, Facebook gets millions of dollars of free labor from average developers who want a new feature added to this code or want to debug a current issue. And then these people who are reliant on this code go in and fix it themselves. So it's actually easier for Facebook to have it open source or for companies to have this open source because they get free labor and free contributions, which reap rewards in and of themselves, which means obviously you also get benefits there in terms of your ability to have, like, not have to mitigate or apply to for every single specific use case. It's very expensive for Meta to, like, say I want to create React to work in TallMill or something, but a TallMill developer would develop it themselves. So they're able to get greater market capture in terms of their products. Okay, secondly, in terms of the ability to regulate, I think their stuff about China is just really stupid. China built this anyway, but also, like, why would China want to make a racist facial, like, recognition app? If China wants to be racist, they'll train the best model they can and then use it in racist ways. It's unclear why changing the training set is a tipping point in this debate. Okay, let's talk about the actual analysis and extension you get from Diggory and why this is super important. First, voluntary participation products. What he tells you is that you're going to get expansions of AI that you would never get on the other side, because companies will only develop in large sectors that they see a meaningful market return in. And they're unlikely to develop in very niche cases, say like largely unspoken languages, which would never get investment or development on the other side. That is, Swahili is not seen by OpenAI as a super relevant market to build large language models in. But if I'm a Swahili company or I'm a Swahili developer, I might go in myself and develop in those specific industries because I know the specific niche cases. I'm able to acquire the talent based on my regional bases. Large companies usually aren't able to do that because they don't understand these specific niche markets, which we can get more applications of this AI to appeal and benefit more people. 2, innovation in markets. The real unique analysis that Diggory provides you here is that the costs substantially change. If I am a small startup, the cost for me to invent a new technology is substantially cheaper at the point at which I don't need to reinvent reinvent the wheel to develop technology, right? So if I'm a small pharmaceutical company, or more important, if I'm a large pharmaceutical company and I want to invest money in treating things that don't have a huge market return, like small rare tropical diseases or sickle cell anemia or language models, no thank you, in like largely unspoken languages, in status quo, the costs to develop those are humongous. On the flip side, when this tech is open source, the economic analysis changes, and you're more likely to have actors involved in those sectors. This again flips OO's material in this debate, because OO says you don't get startup capital. You actually don't get startup capital when the industry is a monopoly and when your industry is competing against OpenAI in order to make a profit. We flip that analysis at the point at which now you don't have to compete against Google. You can actually collaborate with Google because you get the same tech as them, and so it's actually much more startup capital gets invested because the initial cost to develop this tech is much lower. So we actually flip innovation in that capacity. Weighing this against OG then, I think OG tells you very broadly about regulation, or says the word innovation. We give you the specific market analysis by which A, you get technology in sectors that would never be researched before because the startup capital cost and status quo are so humongous, and we change that calculus at the point at which it's open source. So in terms of on the comparative, you never get investment into small tropical diseases for things like protein folding, or large language models, or spam filters, or like anti-hate speech filters in largely unspoken languages. The only avenue to access, I think, is a humongous impact of this debate because it affects millions of people who are never helped on the comparative. So proud to propose.
Thank you, Governor. Let's not call up.
Okay, am I audible?
Yes, you are.
All right, great. Give me 1 second to organize things. Okay. POIs preferably only in chat. Don't unmute. Okay. I'm going to start my speech in 3, 2, 1. There will be 3 things in the speech. First, clarifying the extension from CO, which CG seems determined to misrepresent. Secondly, weighing against both government benches with responses, and finally weighing over our opening. There were 3 parts to the extension Justin gave you. The first one was an analytical extension where we filled a lot of the mechanistic gaps that OO had. He tells you why 1, you get the worst harms of OG's black box issues not manifesting because there doesn't exist as much of an incentive to misuse technology as they might think. But secondly, he tells you why access to information isn't nearly as hard to come by on our comparative as government seems to think, because there already exist public research institutions and already exists democratization of knowledge to a certain extent from academic places, which means that people still gain access to the baseline information without needing to gain access to the fruit of labor of other people who do these things. But thirdly, he fixes the collaboration push by dealing with OG's analysis on that. But the second and more important part of the extension is specifically about the principle of intellectual property. Now, people have laughed and said, oh, you're not going to win on the principle. I don't know if that's the case, though, because the one pushback I get from government on the principle, which Justin already explains to you the violation and why does this comes prior to pragmatic concerns, the one pushback we get is on safety from both gov benches, right? But I think it's okay insofar as we prove to you in our third extension about misuse that safety actually gets worse on your side of the house because you grant access to this technology and the misuses that come to it to a completely unregulatable group of actors. I'll elaborate on that a little more in a second. But the implication of this means that if government doesn't win the safety clash, if they cannot prove to you that they don't fundamentally cut back on the danger that AI poses when they make this open source, they have no ground to stand upon the principle, which means we win on that. But the most important part of the extension then is the third one on misuse. The greatest harm in this round panel doesn't stem from corporations or people with bad, but rather from individuals who now have access to powerful models without restriction. This is a far more approximate harm because panel, I don't fear the shadow tech cabal that OG points out. I fear the bad-intentioned individuals who now have the capacity to victimize their neighbors with the AI models that OG and CG democratize. What is the weighing? I think this is a certain harm because 1, intuitively the incentive to cause harm obviously exists. We already have fraudsters, we already have people who dox other people or create deepfake porn and things like that. The issue is the capacity of them to cause this harm now increases because they no longer just have access to what's already open source. Government forces companies to divulge their most strong potential models, the things with the most highest level of abuse that otherwise would be proprietary, which means that the ability to weaponize these models now becomes far stronger. The one pushback we get from CG is on restrictions, right? But my question is, how do you restrict the access of individuals to this technology when it's already open source? Panel, the government can't even stop piracy when it happens, right? I don't know how it is that they have the somehow ability to mitigate the worst individual harms that occur when people decide to weaponize this technology in all the ways that Justin told you. I think this is going to win the round then, because stronger proprietary models become become open in your world, which clearly creates an increased capacity to cause harm. This is the tipping point to safety on their side of the house. It gets far worse when I allow individuals to do whatever the fuck they want with this technology. I'll take OG real quick.
Our case is not about faster innovation. Our case is about slower but better innovation. DLO drops 4 of the 6 reasons we gave for why innovation still happens and strawmans our case.
Yeah.
We also preempted your material about academia doing it anyway.
Okay, so I think this doesn't interact with the point I just made about misuse. I'll give you that probably dropped your case. Like, you're probably beating them. That's fine. Moving on then to the CG case, which I think is probably largely derivative. So I'm going to deal with most of it when it comes in OG. The first push we get is on innovation, and the first thing they tell me is that companies can't like co-opt AI because the costs to do so are so high, which means like if I put my AI model on, it's not a disadvantage. No one else can steal it. I wish they had listened to their opening here, because this fully knifes all of OG's mechs on like accessibility and innovation in the first place, and also is just I don't think how technology works. But the second push now is on collaboration, right? I think this seems largely derivative of what comes out of OG. I'm going to deal with that in the OG push itself. There's finally a mech on leapfrogging, which I think is fully writ large derivative from OG, when they tell you that companies can piggyback off of whatever other mechanisms already exist, or provide like the basis for other companies to do things. I'm going to deal with those now in the OG case, right? So the first thing we get from OG is the push on accessibility. I think they have 3 main issues with it. The first one is there already exists some capability to check back against like bad models or things that aren't working as they should already, as I pointed out in the POI. Muzi's response was, no, you need to be an expert to do that. But clearly you need to be an expert to do it either way, right? Like the average layman is not going to look at a huge set of code and be like, oh, I understand how this works and can like debug it and say things about it, which means that experts on both sides of the house are the ones who are actually doing the regulating. At this point, I think OG fails to prove why there's such an increased capacity to check back from experts when they have access to code instead of the outputs of these language models themselves, when you're concerned about the outputs and how they function. The second one on democratizing information. I want to point out that some information is already available. I've already pointed this out. Moving on then. The third thing on accountability. I think that there are clearly other ways to regulate these forms of companies. Justin told you about some of them. The second and more interesting thing here is on innovation, because they tell you that there are high barriers to entry. I think we already beat this at the point at which we tell you about academics and the availability of other information in Justin's speech, but there's an issue on the prisoner's dilemma, which they tell you. I tell you that OG actually makes a worse prisoner's dilemma, because what happens now is I have a choice of whether to invest in technology or not, and I probably choose actively not to do so, because at the point in which I pour in the thousands or hundreds of thousands of dollars that I need to develop this technology, other companies can now use that as a starting point and use all the money that they saved in comparative advantage to me to just develop the technology more on their world. This is the intuitive push from both op benches that I just don't think you can argue away. It just is simple like market incentive, right? If it's the case that I've spent a large amount of money to do something and I'm competing in a field for it, and my competitors can now take all that money and just use the results as however they wish, I don't know why I invest in the first place, right? But then we get this push on leapfrogging, which is that they're going to allow this like access to like this like AI to help other people. For example, like Amazon is going to create an AI that's then going to function for like websites so everyone else can build on it for their own AI. I want to point out the incentive to do so vanishes on their side, but it actually appears on our side. This is a flip of the innovation, because think about things like Amazon Web Services, where Amazon says, oh, I have the ability to monetize my particular server protocols, my particular softwares, and provide them to other companies for a fee, and they're going to use them because they don't want to develop their own AI. This is probably what happens in the counterfactual, which is what Justin tells you, right? The issue then is we have incentives on our side to share some level of open source information, to share some level of like softwares, which specifically come because of the monetization like argument. These don't appear on government side, which I think flips their case on leapfrogging. Finally, then on OO, I think the main issue with OO is that even if we give them their best, and I don't think they get it, because I think OG is beating them on the innovation point, right? What happens now is the best thing that they prove is you get some moderate benefits to innovation. There's some moderate harms to innovation on their side. I think we prove a far more proximate harm from CO when we tell you specifically that what happens is individuals who now have the ability to misuse this information, screw over people on a systemic level. I want to point out that this extension clearly wins the round because of the magnitude of harm and the certainty of harm that it creates. I don't care where innovation goes on the corporate level, where restrictions and like things occur, if it's going to screw me over on the fundamental level with people in their homes not able to be safe because of AI. So proud to oppose.
Thank you, Oppositionip. Thank you, debaters, to maneuver virtually across the House and kindly leave this room for the deliberation. All the best, everyone.